It's nice to see everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Elena Gustavson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Business Advisory and Resource Manager at the Vermont Community Loan Fund. You are joining the Paycheck Protection Program Loan Forgiveness webinar, which will be conducted and facilitated by Emma Enoch, who is one of our loan officers here at VCLF. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started, before Emma introduces herself. You should all have your microphones muted at this time. If you haven't, if you could go ahead and do so, that would be great. Just a reminder that we are recording these webinars. There will be an opportunity at the end of this. We'll have about 15 or 20 minutes to ask questions and talk. But at the end of this, you are more than welcome to unmute your microphone to ask any questions. And the chat box should be available to you through this entire time. So as Emma is going through the slideshow and talking about the step-by-step process, please don't hesitate to ask questions. I will monitor the chat box for her so she can focus on the presentation. And we'll take it from there. So at this moment, I think, Emma, you've got screening. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and let Emma take over.
Perfect. Thank you, Alina. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the PPP Loan Forgiveness webinar. I'll also put a plug in for Alina's webinar next week on the 18th, sort of a little workshop series, so tune into that. But as Alina said, I'm Emma. We're also joined with Dan Winslow, who's our Director of Business and Early Care and Learning Lending. Hi, Dan. We've got Heather, who's our Director of Housing and Community Facilities, and Alina as well. So I guess the first thing I'll say before we jump in is this presentation is based off of the most recent guidance we have from the SBA. Which is a very diplomatic way of saying that they change the guidance often, and as of 12:59 today, this is what we know. Obviously, we can't predict what they'll put out tomorrow. We are not the SBA, but we do keep up to date with what the SBA is putting out pretty much daily. So this is what we know. Inevitably, there may be some questions that we don't know the answer to, but rest assured, we will get to them either if you do it in the chat box or ask follow-up. If there's a question we don't know the answer to, we will look into it and we will get back to you. So with that said, the first thing we'll go over is payroll and non-payroll costs. So I know all of you are in a different spot with your PPP fund spending. And with an initial conversation with a few of you, you expressed interest in understanding eligible payroll and non-payroll costs that can be forgiven. So that's what we'll go over. We'll chat about how to calculate forgiveness, the necessary documents you'll need in order to substantiate what you're asking to be forgiven. We'll go over there are two PPP applications that you can submit. So we'll go over the difference between those two. Then we'll go over the timeline, you know, who to submit to, what you can expect after that. And then there'll be a Q&A session where you can ask us questions. You can also chat with each other, we'll hold space for you all to have a dialogue. So hopefully that will be enriching. The first thing I'll say also is some new updates. Forgiveness applications are now open. So if you have spent all of your PPP funds and you're ready to beg forgiveness, you can start that process. Another thing we'll mention is originally the SBA said that payments were to be deferred for 6 months. They extended that to 10 months. So while it's accruing interest, no payments are due for 10 months on your PPP loan. Additionally, they extended the amount of time you have to spend these funds from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. And there is some flexibility in there. If you spend the funds like faster than the 24 weeks, that's okay. You can apply for forgiveness when the funds are spent. And additionally, should any amount of your PPP loan not be forgiven, it's a 5-year term at 1%. Originally, it was 2%, 2 years, so now it's 5 years. So we'll jump right into it. Most of this should be familiar to you all since you went through the application process, but I'll just quickly go over payroll and non-payroll costs that are eligible for forgiveness. So we have salary, wages, and tips up to $100,000. Vacation, parental, family, medical, and sick leave all qualify. Disability insurance, state and local taxes. Most people will use unemployment insurance tax, etc. What doesn't qualify within that is any funds you used from the Families First Act during your PPP qualified period. So, if you had an employee that was sick and, COVID related and you used the Families First Act monies to pay them, that's not eligible for forgiveness. But if you paid them with that money before your PPP loan came through, that is okay. You also, if you hire independent contractors or, workers' comp premiums, anything like that, that's not included. Additionally, if you are self-employed or sole proprietor, single member LLC, anything like that, your healthcare and retirement contributions are also not eligible for forgiveness. But otherwise, those employer-sponsored benefits are eligible for forgiveness. So that goes over the payroll costs that are eligible. Going over to non-payroll, we have the business mortgage interest payments, business utility payments, and the rent or lease payments. And those are broken down so you can see lease can qualify if you're leasing equipment, vehicle, or space. And then utility payments, you can see what qualifies under that. The most important thing when using money to pay for these non-payroll costs is that in order for them to be forgiven, they had to have been accounts in existence before February 15th of this year. And you'll want to establish documentation to support that now. So moving on, in an effort to understand what exactly can be forgiven, we are working with a couple of different calculators right now. This one on your screen is from a CPA that's been going through as the PPP process has been, rolled out and keeping up with resources. So this is from him. That will be a link that we'll share with you all after this webinar. It's a really quick way to wrap your head around what can possibly be forgiven, but this is not necessarily a guaranteed number. That is definitely your responsibility with the help of your lender and their capacity to get you to that number, but that is a really helpful resource. Additionally, VCLF has developed a calculator and a spreadsheet, which we will also share with you, that you can cross-reference, as you calculate for forgiveness. But essentially, the first number you'll want to know, and I'm sure you all are familiar with, is the loan amount. So base that off of what was deposited in your account and not what you put on your application. Many of you got a different amount of money, more money than you put on your application. So use what was deposited on your bank statement for that. Next, you'll sum up your payroll costs, and then you'll sum up the non-payroll costs that are eligible. And then this next part, if you phase in and out of this webinar and you're gonna listen to 2 or 3 things, this next thing is definitely something you wanna turn your ears on for. If you reduced the wages for your employees by more than 25% during your covered period, you're going to want to include that calculation into this calculation because that will reduce what is forgivable. So for those of you who sort of learned through example, for instance, if you'll base this off of what you were paying people from January to March 2020, and then your qualifying period. Now, that is the general SBA guidelines, but that can be taken on a case-by-case basis, but for the point of this explanation, let's say from January to March, you were paying somebody $15 an hour, 40 hours a week, and then you had to decrease their salary to $12 an hour. Essentially what you'll want to do is take the number that you were paying them during that initial period, January through March, multiply it by 0.75 to understand what the 25% reduction would be. If you reduced it by more than that, sum it up and throw it in there, and that is not forgivable. The next thing that you'll want to understand, and I'll touch base about this more in depth because it's one of the more complicated parts of this application, is the full-time equivalent portion. And again, you'll base the comparison period off of what you used with your application. So during your covered period, which is when you are spending PPP funds, you'll want to keep track of your full-time equivalents. I'll break that down in the next slide. And then once, the calculator on the website, you'll see it magically calculates all of that for you. So then that gives you a really basic understanding of what could be forgiven. So full-time equivalent, there are two different methods you can use to calculate this. The actual method and then the simplified method. The simplified method was put out by the SBA to make it simple. So the actual method, if you want to, you can use either, but you have to be consistent throughout your application. So you can't switch back and forth. But you can run calculations using both methods and use whichever one is to your benefit, essentially. So for the actual method, what I would do, what might make this more organized, is to open up a spreadsheet or have a piece of paper, and you want to write down each one of your employees and how many hours they typically worked within those payroll periods on a week-by-week basis. And then you'll divide that by 40, round to the nearest tenth, and then that is what the full-time equivalent would be. The simplified method, which is what the SBA, they created math and said you could do it this way. If somebody works 40 hours or more a week, that's 1. If they work less than 40 hours, that's 0.5. So that's a really quick way of doing the calculation. And there's an example on the side here if you want to use that as a template for when you're applying for forgiveness. So moving into what we'll ask of you when you apply for forgiveness. For those of you who got a PPP loan with VCLF, you'll obviously just submit everything to us. For those of you who got a PPP loan with other lenders, they may have, not necessarily different requirements, but maybe a different process. But for VCLF, based on the SBA's guidance, this is what we'll ask for in addition to your forgiveness application. So what I would do if I were you again now is make a folder for PPP forgiveness and start scanning all of your invoices and payroll records into that folder now to keep track of that. We will ask for a copy of all of those scanned records. You'll want to keep a copy for your records in addition to the original copies. So we'll ask for you to verify your payroll and all of your non-payroll costs. We'll also ask you to verify that all of those accounts were already existing before February 15th. So if you could find that now, that will only make this process quicker for you. We'll ask for, again, payroll reports, tax filings, which is similar to when you were applying. And then we will ask for documentation to verify those employer-sponsored benefits. So when you're ready to apply, and you have to use all of the funds before you're ready to apply for forgiveness, or decide that you want to give some of the money back. You're done with the PPP and you're ready to apply for forgiveness. If you Google PPP forgiveness application, these are the top 2 resources that will pop up. These are the only 2 that you should really be using. If you go to like a CPA's website, for instance, because these the guidances and applications change These are the most reliable ones. So you'll want to use either the treasury.gov website or the SBA or your lender. So for those of you who got a PPP loan from VCLF, we can provide that to you, but we also empower you to Google search it and find it either on the SBA website or the Home Treasury website. So the PPP program is one program, but they have two applications. So there's the easy application, which is short, and then there's the long application, which is long. And essentially, the easy application, there are 3 ways that you can qualify to use the easy application. That's a 3-page application. The long application is 11 pages. I hope and assume most of you will be able to use the easy application. On the left here, you'll see what the SBA is sort of asking you to check yourself on. There are 3 different qualifiers to use the easy application. If you say yes to one of them, you can apply using the easy form. So it's a little jargon heavy to the left, so I broke it down a little bit to the right. So the first question you can ask yourself, are you self-employed, sole proprietor, independent contractor, single member LLC, anything like that? The answer is yes, easy application, you're all good. If the answer is no, you can then ask yourself, okay, well, did I reduce salary and wages by more than 25%? If the answer is no, you're good to go. If you did, but you did not reduce the number of employees or average paid hours, so essentially that translates to if you kept staff on, but you were paying them, but they weren't working, that's still okay. So if that rings true to you, you can use the easy form. The third qualifier, sort of step 2, the first one, if that, that's the same. But then the second part of step 3 is if you reduced your employees because you were required to by law, then obviously, if that is yes for you, you can use the easy application. If the answer is no, you will go with the longer form application. So these are what the 2 applications look like on their first page. There's really no identifier for whether it's the long one besides the fact that it's long. And then the easy one specifies at the top, it'll say 3508 easy. So that's how you can tell the difference besides the length of the application. So essentially, the process, and hopefully this webinar as it's recorded and circulated will be sort of a skeleton to-do list for you as you start applying for forgiveness. But step 1, you'll want to start compiling your records for the PPP funds that you're using and spending now, and also to verify that you had those accounts beforehand. You'll go through and determine which application to use, your forgiveness qualifying amount, and then you can submit that to your lender. Once it's submitted to your lender, and for those of you who got a PPP loan from us, you submitted it through the VCLF at vclf.org email. We'll ask that you use that same email when applying for forgiveness. So once you send that over to us, we will confirm receipt that we got your application. We will have our own checklist for what we'll want to see. The SBA has a checklist too, which is another thing that will circulate out to you with this webinar. So you'll go through, you'll make sure all of your, application materials are there. We will double check it. And if something's missing, we'll just email you, we'll ask for that follow up. We have 60 days to make a decision on whether we are approving it or denying it. And it's important to note that if you have to submit a newly signed application or an extra payroll record or anything like that, that 60-day period doesn't start over. But when we, approve it, hopefully your forgiveness application, we will then submit it to the SBA. They have 90 days to approve it. And if they require additional information from you, their 90 days starts over every time they ask for an additional material. So just sort of keep that in the back of your mind that the process can take a little longer on the SBA's end as it seems to do So what we will do next is circulate this webinar. We'll send you the CPA calculator and the VCLF calculator to understand your forgiveness. We'll share the SBDC step-by-step video, which is something originally that we were going to go over in this webinar was step-by-step going through both applications. Not to, in an effort to give you all space to ask questions and to not reinvent the wheel, we're going to circulate those step-by-step tutorials to you. There are 3 different videos put out by the SBDC. One is an hour long, 45 minutes long. They'll walk you through every line of the application. So we'll send that over to you. It's hugely helpful. There's also an FAQ sheet that, maybe if additional questions pop up that you didn't think of in the webinar, you can check that. The SBA is answering those questions. We'll also send you a checklist for what we hope to see in your application. And we'll share the SBA and Treasury website, although it's a very simple Google search. What you could be doing now is everything we sort of talked about, scanning your files, keeping track of your payroll records, starting to understand how to calculate forgiveness, etc. And ask questions throughout all of this. But for now, if you have questions you want to ask, considering many of you have pretty case-by-case applications, we wanted to give you more time to ask questions and sort of hear from each other. So with that, if you have questions, jump in and we'll answer them for you. Yeah, Kevin.
Hi. Thanks, everybody. It's really amazing to be able to go through this whole process and to know that you're here to support all of us. That's just been tremendously helpful knowing that. So thank you all for your hard work. Much appreciated. It seems actually pretty clear and straightforward from our point of view. I think basically we have just between payroll and the lease that's gobbled up all the funds. So I think it's pretty straightforward and simple. I think we'll just begin the process and iron things out as we move forward. So thank you.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Kevin, I'm actually going to jump in. I remember you asking a quick question about whether you can take on additional employees and use PPP funds for that, and the answer is yes. And if you reduced your staff, you can bring them back on and use those PPP funds. That's sort of the goal of the program. By December 31st, we want to get you back up to your original headcount, and you can increase that if you need to and use PPP funds for that. So the goal of the program was to get staff back, get staff back and being paid. So that's to answer your question on that. I don't know if that's applicable anymore, but it might be.
Yeah, so would we postpone applying until we know how that's going to sugar out in the future? Or?
Postpone applying for forgiveness?
Yes.
So you can, but you want to make sure, you have 10 months before payments are due, and you have the 24-week qualifying period to spend those funds. So you'll want to, hire people, and use those funds up until 24 weeks is over. If you had to reduce staff and you're asking them to come back on, if they say no, and that doesn't get you back up to your full time by December 31st, that does not reduce your forgiveness. So you'll want written documentation that you offered that back, their job, and you'll want it documented that they essentially refused the hire. But that wouldn't reduce your forgiveness.
Good, thank you. Clear.
Hi, Emma, it's Heather. I had a question along that line too, because that's my concern. I'm opening and I've just learned that the majority of my families are working from home. So I'm not going to need at least it looks like for the foreseeable future, the level of staffing that I did have. And I'm kind of stuck between, I have enough staff right now to open with this tiny group of kids that I have. So I'm kind of debating whether I should give the loan back or if I can still get it forgiven if I can't end up hitting that FTE.
Yeah, so if I understand your question correctly, if you can't get back up to full-time staff that you had when you applied, because either people aren't coming back on or you're following guidance that won't reduce what you can get forgiven, you can keep paying people who are home and not working to keep them on payroll. That does qualify for PPP forgiveness.
Okay.
Let me know if that doesn't answer your question, and
Yeah,
I'm also happy to follow up with you after.
So for example, okay, yeah, I might need to follow up with you. For example, though, I have like one employee I know is going to be doing remote teaching to her son. So she's asked to not come back. And I don't need her really anyway. So I should get that in writing.
You should get that in writing that she is going to stay home and would prefer to be home teaching her son and will not be coming back to work.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, and I'll follow up with you too.
Okay.
Hi, Emma. We have employees that have chosen to reduce their hours for many different reasons. How does that affect, or should we just pay them what their full-time would be for the 8 weeks? And then.
Yeah, from what I understand of the guidance, you can continue to pay people at the rate that you were paying them if they're a salaried employee. Hourly, the rate of pay, if you're continuing to pay them the same amount, that won't influence, even if the number of hours they work is reduced, that won't necessarily influence your forgiveness.
So you would just have to use those funds for payroll by the end of the 24.
Yes.
So some of our people may not come back to, so our hours are being reduced, but the pay has stayed the same. So
Right.
we just extend down, instead of paying everyone 8 weeks, we can pay them if they went from 40 to 30 hours, 30 hours each week until the money's used up, and that won't affect.
Mostly. There's a little bit of a gray area there where
Okay.
if, you know, that changes your full-time equivalent calculation if it's less than 40 hours. So that's a good question. I'll make note of that and I can follow up with you, you know, in an email and let you know that.
Thank you.
I actually have a situation like that as well. I have one employee that is staying home to remote teach and another one that's decided to go to school online. So she's specifically asked to not be full-time and only work 2 days a week. And the hours work fine with the light load at the center. But I just didn't know if I could still get funds forgiven if that was the case.
Yeah, I think initially the answer is yes, but so we can look at that. Essentially, as long as you're continuing to pay people the hourly rate that you were, and then for, you know, any reason why they can't come back on, whether the guidance says no more than X number of kids per one room, you know, if there are qualifying reasons that they can't be back on full time, then that won't affect your forgiveness.
We have a few more minutes. Does anyone have any other questions in relation to this webinar or any of the resources that Emma shared? Okay. Well, Emma, thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. And again, if folks need to follow up on a case-by-case basis with questions, we're more than happy to field those.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Again, as I mentioned in the chat box and Emma mentioned throughout the webinar, we'll make sure to get you the resources and the links that were shown in this webinar, as well as a link to this recording in case you'd like to review any of it again. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.